First Newsline with Deprose Muchena.
And very good evening to you and a warm welcome to Newsline Live. And our guest today is the Senior Director at Amnesty International, Mr. Deprose Muchena. Very good evening to you, Mr. Muchena, and welcome to Newsline Live.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for coming. Amnesty International have chosen Sri Lanka to launch its annual report, so to speak, the global state of HR in Sri Lanka. Is that any special significance?
Yeah, it is very important for us to be in Sri Lanka to launch the global report, but also launch our regional report. Sri Lanka hosts the regional office of Amnesty International in South Asia. South Asia is a significant geography of the world with at least a quarter of the world's population. Some of the exciting growth stories have come out of this continent, but also some of the worrisome human rights challenges have come out of this continent. And we thought that it was important, as we turned 62 this year, Amnesty International, to be based here and to speak with South Asians in general, with Sri Lankans in particular, as we launch this important document that assesses the state of human rights across the world.
We'll come back to the state of human rights in this region in a minute, but I was wondering, Mr. Muchena, if you could tell us, what is the history of Amnesty International?
Yeah, thank you very much. Amnesty is a people's movement. It is turning 62 years now, this year. So it has been around, established through the efforts of those who took injustice personally at the time that it was established. Mr. Peter Benenson, a British human rights lawyer, who took exception at the state of the world at the time he was practicing his law. There is a story about him putting an op-ed in the British Observer, which was spotlighting the state of prisoners who were forgotten. And from then on, it mobilized global sentiment that has engineered, at least now, more than 10 million members, activists and supporters around the world who associate and identify with Amnesty as their organization. And we are now working in at least 78 countries around the world with 8 regional offices that cover significantly larger number of countries in one.
And how does Amnesty International categorize someone as a prisoner of conscience?
This is a categorization that we apportion to an individual who we believe has been arrested not because they have committed any crime, but they've been arrested because of their belief. They've been arrested for what they stand for. And so when that happens, the case is significant enough that if we take it up as a prisoner of conscience case, it sends far wider implications to society, but it also sends a message that Amnesty International will stand with those who are persecuted, will stand with human rights defenders at risk, but will also stand with those that are put in harm's way by those who are powerful in society. They can be government, they can be corporates, they can be any other entity that could find itself with enough power to intimidate, maim, or even kill a person.
And within all this ambience, how important is civic space to ensure freedom of expression and assembly?
Civic space is probably the most significant global asset for ordinary people. With civic space means that you can have the space to be creative. Normally, countries that are prosperous oftentimes open space for invention, open space for debate, open space for critical reflection by its citizens in order to come up with solutions outside of mainstream. So when we defend civic space, which in fact is the global priority of our global strategy now, we do so because we believe only when you are defending civic space can you enable enjoyment of rights, can you enable protection of rights, and can you enable interdependent solidarity between peoples of the world. So it is a vital asset for people. That means laws, policies and programs that governments come up with should advance the growth of civic space rather than shrink it, which tends to be what is happening right now.
And Mr. Muchena, what do you see? What are the trends you see in South Asia with regard to civic space and the ability of civil society to function freely, its challenges perhaps?
Well, we in fact actually cover South Asia as part of our global human rights State of the World Human Rights Report. And we see trends that we see globally, which is governments deploying repressive legislation to curtail freedoms. We see a vicious, well-calculated assault on civil liberties that are designed to limit the space for imagination by ordinary people. From Afghanistan, Bangladesh, India, here in Sri Lanka, we have seen protest movements rising in the last year or two in response to the triple burden of unemployment, of poverty and inequality. Biting economic crisis has been registered in countries like Sri Lanka with significant levels of inflation that are uncontrollable, which have fed sentiment of protest. And in response, many governments have sought to limit expression of the will of the people by dropping legislation that is draconian, or using legislation, abusing legislation, or misusing legislation in order to achieve narrow political ends. This is a global trend that we find not only in South Asia, but we find that in Africa, we find that in Europe, and we find it in the Americas.
And in your report, you note the various events that happened in Sri Lanka and the challenges and the use of these draconian and rather harsh laws like the PTA, which has all served to sort of impinge on the people's right to protest and so on. How important was this? How did you identify it? How importantly did you find that this was impinging on the people's rights?
In fact, we found out that in at least 29 of the 156 countries that we looked at in our annual report, governments attempted to introduce new laws in response to civic expression so that they punish dissent. We also found that in at least 77 countries of the 156 countries we looked at, governments attempted and in fact carried out arbitrary detention of human rights defenders, civil society leaders, union leaders, students, and ordinary people who were standing up for human rights. So what we saw across the world is also reflected in South Asia in general. We found that in Sri Lanka in particular. So the use of the PTA legislation that you are talking about has been successfully used by successive governments over the years. And we have been saying today in the launch of our annual report, it is time to reset the button and put human rights at the center of negotiations, of national conversations, of international conversations, because we are concerned with the double standards that are emerging around the world, in which on the one end you see a very united force of global superpowers in response to Russian aggression on Ukraine, but you don't see similar united force in response to crisis in Afghanistan, the crisis in Syria, and even when the protest movement was center stage in Sri Lanka here.
And how do you deal, or how do governments react to? They may view this as meddling. But how does Amnesty International manage to survive and cope with governments that may not be entirely happy?
First, we are independent of any government. Amnesty International is an independent global movement. It does not take money from any government in the world. It doesn't take money from corporates. It is a people-driven movement, provides support from its own resources. Our research is independently financed by members, and we stick to international human rights standards that we make expression when we do research. So we make findings in terms of international human rights law, to which many of the governments have signed up to. So all we are doing is reminding governments of what they have signed up to, but we also see ourselves as an entity and a movement that works with governments, because ultimately at the end of the day, the enactment of laws, of policies to effect changes in the real lives of real people will ultimately come from government. So we are not an anti-government entity. We are, in fact, a pro-human rights organization that believes that governments have a role to play. So we will constantly be reminding governments we see them as partners rather than as enemies.
And thank you very much for your questions. 0772 300 305. Our guest today is Mr. Deprose Muchena, the Senior Director at Amnesty International. I'll take this one question from the public, Mr. Muchena. Why does Amnesty International oppose the death penalty?
Yeah, that's a good question. We are opposed to the death penalty because we see it as a piece of law that, if it is used in the context of unfair trials, there is no recourse to people who have been unfairly accused of crimes that they have committed. So we see it as a cruel and degrading treatment which is anti-human rights. We see also the death penalty as not posing, at least going by studies, any particular deterrent effect on crime. There isn't studies we have seen which demonstrate that when you have the death penalty, you have a particular deterrent effect on crime. So we believe that justice should be restorative rather than vengeful.
And in all over the world, where is there any country that sort of is outstanding in terms of its rehabilitation of prisoners, giving them as much rights as the other man, but they are in prison?
The general trend across the world is a pro-human rights world. The general trend, for example, is abolition when it comes to the death penalty. When we started in Amnesty International, a handful of countries were abolishing or had abolished the death penalty in law and in practice. But today, the majority of countries have abolished. It is very important that when we have prisons, we see them as places that are going to be corrective centers rather than punitive centers. One of the studies that we have done in Madagascar looked at the state of prisons in that country, and we saw that at least 78% of the women who were in Madagascar jails were there on pre-trial detention. And most of them had committed very petty offenses, but they were being subjected to conditions that assumed that they were actually as guilty as charged. So prisons are places where human rights violations can take place, and much more those prisoners who are awaiting trial are at the most vulnerable risk of their rights being taken away from them, because at that time they don't even know why they are there. So we see prisons as places of detention, of course, but it's a place where we test the obligations of the state in terms of international human rights law.
And again, not just Sri Lanka specific, but around the world. Have you found a growing trend anywhere there where you have deaths in custody, for example?
Yes, not necessarily a growing trend, but we definitely have worked on cases where people have died in custody at the hands of the police and prison officials with very limited explanation. More so, we take an active interest if the charges that they faced were politically motivated, or if they were a human rights defender, a pro-democracy activist, or any other person who was standing for human rights and they were jailed for their work. So it is important that states that carry out detention or who run places of detention do so in terms of several pieces of law that protect prisoners in domestic jurisdictions and law, but also in terms of their international obligations. Because we believe that ultimately the role of the state is to protect life rather than to take it.
Thank you. On that note, let me just remind you again that you can send your questions in 0772 300 305 by WhatsApp or SMS. Thank you. Our guest is Deprose Muchena, who is the Senior Director at Amnesty International. We are in the second half, we'll be discussing what's in that report, in the annual report. In the meantime, it's time to take a break and take a peek at this evening's headline news from the Newsfirst Primetime News team. We'll see you on the other side of the break.
Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali. Petroleum trade unions go on strike. Fuel distribution from Kolonnawa hampered. Finance Minister sends charge sheet to Public Utilities Chief. Demands reasons to not terminate service within 7 days.
මම මේ චෝදනාවලට බය නැහැ. මම මේ චෝදනා එනකම් බලන් හිටියේ. මේ චෝදනාවට මම උත්තර දීලා තියෙනවා. මේ පාර්ලිමේන්තුවේ ඡන්දයෙන් මාව අයින් කිරීමේ විශාල හැකියාවක් තියෙනවා. මම අපි දන්නවා කොහොමද පාර්ලිමේන්තුව වැඩ කරන්නේ කියලා. ඒ හින්දා මට කිසිම ප්‍රශ්නයක් නැහැ. Oil pipeline from India to Trincomalee. President says discussions underway. Amnesty International says Sri Lanka was one of the many countries that disrupted right to protest. Former Corp chairman alleges privatization is done to secure commissions.
ශ්‍රී ලංකන් එයාලයින් එක ලංකාවේ මුලින්ම පෞද්ගලීකරණය කෙරුවා. ඒ වෙලාවෙත් කොමිස් මුදලක් ගියා. පෞද්ගලීකරණය රජයට ගත්තා. ඒ වෙලාවෙත් කොමිස් මුදලක් ආවා.
Israel protests. Prime Minister Netanyahu delays legal reforms after day of strikes. Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
And welcome back to Newsline Live. I'm in conversation with the Senior Director at Amnesty International, Mr. Deprose Muchena. Mr. Muchena, Sri Lanka has been accused of various violations of human rights and so on. And yet, Sri Lanka managed in the space of 11 months to obtain an IMF facility to help us. How did it all balance out?
Well, many countries around the world are able to access the International Monetary Fund assistance package. In a way, those global institutions, the financial system, depends on loaning countries that are in distress the money that they need. We must also realize that the IMF is the lender of last resort. So there is nowhere else to go after that. You need to go to the IMF and get a standby loan or a package of assistance to unlock money from the Paris Club of Creditors. Our particular interest as Amnesty International on things such as the IMF deal that it is negotiating with the government of Sri Lanka is to ensure that everything that goes on there enhances the focus on helping people, that any loan contraction process should prioritize human rights rather than diminish them. It is also very important that when countries go into contraction processes with the World Bank and IMF, that everything is done in a transparent way, that there is accountability for delivering on the promise of the package, and that it is important that Sri Lanka prioritizes social protection. Because if you go into austerity and you then undermine social protection of people, you are retaining a cycle of desperation on the part of the people. So that's what we would say on the IMF with respect to Sri Lanka.
Thank you. And what about the other sort of pain in the side of the people of a certain section of community, gender rights? How does Amnesty, how is Sri Lanka fared, and how does the region fare?
In fact, it's a key call that we make in our global report, that not only did we see the double standards of the global international community responding through picking and choosing which human rights issue to stand for. And this is a continuation from the COVID days when they decided vaccine nationalism was also part of the menu in responding to a global pandemic. We have also seen that this repression, the deployment of draconian legislation in response to protest movement, heavily undermined the rights of women. We also saw that the rights of women were assaulted by those governments that were deciding that it is not legal for girls who are pregnant to continue with school, We also saw for countries like Pakistan that became really impacted by climate change through the heat wave and floods, that more often than not, the impacts on climate change on ordinary people became more gendered. So there is an overrepresentation of women when it comes to human rights violations, almost like a gendered impact of the violations of rights, whether it's repression of protest, whether it's climate justice issues, and whether it's actually delivery of healthcare and other services. Across the world, we documented the impact of these violations on women, and once again directing the governments to reset the button on protection, on prioritizing, and on targeting.
And would this be the same for the LGBT community as well? How do you see that? Is there better tolerance or not at all, or is there in trouble?
We saw fundamentally an assault on minorities, whether they are sexual minorities, whether they are religious minorities, countries like India, and the targeting of Muslim minorities. In China, it escaped the international censor when it clearly violated and attacked the rights of Muslim minorities. LGBTI communities were also scapegoated, demonized in different parts of the world, and discrimination continued to be rampant, including caste-based discrimination in South Asia, in different countries of South Asia. But we also saw discrimination on the basis of race. So this double standards argument we are putting is clearly manifest when you look at people of racial minorities being targeted. So once again, we're calling on governments to work together and not pick and choose which human rights issue they stand for. We do not want to see the blueprint that we believe now is available in the world for protection of refugees. We saw the globe opening its doors to Ukraine fleeing refugees into Europe. We have not seen those doors opening for refugees from Syria, from Afghanistan, and from other countries that don't look like the people who are receiving the refugees. So we are calling on an international human rights protection system that addresses all these issues. To address them, you need global leadership, which is cohesive, which is inspirational, which sees beyond current crisis. And that is part of the challenge that we have had, that the traditional countries that have provided global leadership in the past have become so underwhelming and disappointing that now we are looking to the Prime Minister of Barbados, who is actually now a bigger voice on climate justice than ever before. We're looking to countries like Costa Rica, which during COVID time provided significantly inspirational proposals on reducing cost of technology to enhance access. We are looking at countries like Zambia, President Hakainde Hichilema, who is now a voice for democracy in Southern and Eastern Africa. And so the traditional countries have become those that are picking and choosing which case to stand for, and we are challenging them once again to show leadership in order to tackle the global crises that we are facing.
And does Amnesty International get involved in things like, for example, the constant loss of life by immigrants trying to cross the English Channel?
Definitely. We believe that governments around the world, especially those that are richer with more resources, have an international human rights obligation to protect those who are fleeing conflicts, to receive them and to put them in care that don't do further harm to them. And we now have a blueprint with respect to what we have seen. When political will is there, the global international human rights protection system functions. When political will is not there, the international human rights protection system falters. We have now seen that it is very possible for countries to absorb small populations of people who are fleeing conflict without jeopardizing their capacity to continue to provide services to their own people. And we are calling now on governments to do as they did to Ukraine refugees, to the Rohingyas, to Afghanistan, to people fleeing conflict in DRC, to people fleeing conflict in Ethiopia, and other countries that have not been prioritized globally. Because to continue to fail to imagine a society that protects vulnerable people and weak people is a real underwhelming show of a lack of leadership by countries that should be able to tackle issues such as migration problems. This is why we are seeing even the field of climate justice, the bigger countries with larger volumes of emissions are once again having to be dragged to the table to provide funding into the loss and damage fund, which has now been accepted as a way of dealing with the countries that are really vandalized by the vagaries of climate change, such as Pakistan here, such as Mozambique in Eastern Africa, such as Somalia, that are reeling from all kinds of crises related to climate change that you and I know they didn't cause, because their level of emissions, their level of CO2 emissions into the atmosphere is significantly lower to non-existent.
No interview would be complete especially with a person of your standing, the Senior Director of Amnesty International, without asking you how closely Amnesty International is looking at the plight of the minority communities in Sri Lanka's northeast, who are subject to a 30-year war.
Absolutely. An important priority for us is to support communities of people that are not in the mainstream, communities of people that have historically and successively been marginalized, been demonized, been scapegoated, been targeted. And they could be the Tamil people in Sri Lanka, there could be people with albinism in places like Malawi, there could be refugees, there could be Muslim communities around the world. So we see our role as standing with those who need protection. We see our role as those standing with those that need their voice to be amplified. We will spend a lot of time in this country talking with minority groups so that we are able to respond to them and be relevant to their plight. The strength of Amnesty International historically has been its ability to stand with those that need solidarity at a time when solidarity is really needed. For communities that you are referring to, solidarity is the currency of protection for them. They do not have anyone else. They do not have the big voice that others have. So groups like ours, who are committed to finding the truth, unearthing it and producing it and documenting it, communicating it, I can assure you that you will be finding us providing that active solidarity, not just solidarity, but active solidarity.
I must read out this message because it says that we are delighted that you have such a fantastic guest today in Mr. Muchena. So, thank you, and right from the public, that you're actually here, and that Sri Lanka is not forgotten with its troubles and so on. But overall, Mr. Muchena, are you hopeful? Is there light at this end of this tunnel for the minorities, for the people who are oppressed, the people who are being ill-treated and so on?
There is hope. Personally, myself and my team that I work with, we are driven by the audacity of hope. We believe that when we go into a room that is dark, we don't cast the darkness, we light a candle. And this is what we do today. This is what we will do tomorrow. This is what we have been doing yesterday. It is important that we continue to look back into our history and see the anti-colonial struggles that this region fought to become independent as a driving motive force for the human rights struggles of today. It is important that we look into the strength of the women's movement in this region that fought many battles to become societies that we are now, and take from it inspiration and lessons and perspectives to continue to fight. Without fighting and without focusing on our problems today, we have no other option. I also believe that no problem whatsoever can escape the sustained assault of ideas. And so we believe that our human rights activism, our education, our research, our campaigning, our ability to mobilize whole countries to focus on one country is something that is going to be an enzyme, a catalyst for change. And any society that needs change will eventually get it.
Mr. Deprose Muchena, thank you very much for being on Newsline Live. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
And that's the way it was with Mr. Deprose Muchena. The audacity of hope, indeed. And it's now time for the primetime news, of course. Not before I say, have a great evening, if as much as you can. And of course, God bless you all.